Hi, everybody. It's Dave Shepherd here, and I'm pleased to bring you this new installment of my Azure Digital Twins journey. I'm going to start with my usual views expressed statement, which is the views and public statements I expressed in this presentation are and during this session are my own and do not reflect those of my employer. So with that out of the way, I'd like to essentially go for a recap of the economic strategy that I was trying to implement as part of this Azure Digital Twin setup. And the strategy was summarized in 4 key stages: plan, implement, monitor, and optimize. And for those who've been following this journey, I have been replacing the radiator valves with thermostatic radiator valves. And essentially what this allows me to do is to set the temperature with the valve itself quite accurately. But the benefit of this is that the valve actually contains an IoT sensor, and it uses a protocol known as LoRaWAN to communicate with essentially the Azure services. It does through something called a gateway, which is another device which I have on my home network. For those who aren't aware of this, the challenge that I had last year was the increase in my annual energy cost and energy usage. We're all keen to know and to understand the implications of sustainability and to make a difference. And I realized that between 2023 and 2024, there was a 10% year-on-year change in the energy usage in kilowatt hours. So I thought, let's set about using a digital twin to actually change how this was going to impact my domestic situation. There's some costs here that were involved in the setup of the platform, some of the development tools and services that I used and so on. But ultimately, in fact, the larger part of these costs was actually the devices that I had to invest in. And my strategy was essentially that in 3 years, I wanted my savings on my gas bill to cover 50% of those sunk costs and 100% of the running costs, excluding labor. And when I say the running costs, obviously, of all of the different Azure services that I'm using and so on. So when I looked at the overall costs, what I realized is that we're looking at something like 638 quid over 3 years, which kind of works out to £212 year-on-year savings. So that's my target. That's what I'm trying to achieve. And this is the kind of diagram showing the setup. You can see as I go from left to right, I've got some sensors. They're connected to a gateway, and I'm using an Ethernet connection to my laptop. And essentially, that moves the information to my access point, it's basically internet router I've got connected. On the other side of that, we've got Azure services. So there's the IoT hub, there's the event grid, there's a function that processes the data, and then that pushes the processed data, which is formatted in a very specific way, into an application known as Azure Digital Twins. And that in turn is connected to 3D Scene Studio, which allows you to import models into the environment and to connect the sensor data that's being streamed to it to different elements in that 3D model. On top of that, what we have is what's known as a twin graph. It's a structure of data. Some people refer to it as an ontology. But what it means is that the queries that you can ask can be relational queries, and I'll go into that in a bit later. Additionally, I'm pushing data into a high capacity repository known as an event hub. And what that in turn does is that can connect to something called Azure Data Explorer, and in turn, you can connect that to Microsoft Fabric or Power BI, as some people might know the particular aspect of it that I'm using. So that's my setup. And if I was to look at it in terms of the actual equipment, I've got an access point, which is a essentially TP-Link mesh. I've got my laptop there connected into the docking station. and then that in turn is connected into the gateway. And then there's this Ethernet cable connection that I use to bring it all together. And then I've got these valves which connect into the gateway. And on top of that, as I said in the last post around Azure Digital Twins, I was going to purchase an external temperature and humidity sensor. And that's important because what I'm trying to do is to see if I can understand a relationship between the energy usage in kilowatt hours and the difference in temperature between the external surroundings and the interior of my home. Because if I can understand that relationship, and especially if it's a linear relationship, I can start to predict based on the weather forecast what sort of energy uses I'm going to be incurring, and obviously the costs that are associated with that. So that's my strategy in a nutshell. I'm not going to go into much more detail than that because I want to actually show you what I've done to improve the application. So what we're going to do now is to go quite quickly into Azure Digital Twins. As you can see there are a series of applications which I've gone through, and I will put a link in the chat to the previous explanation of this setup. I don't think you need to go into the detail of it. What's important for you to know is that the data that is in Azure Digital Twins, we can now see it in what's known as the Function app. And I'll just go to show you this. So what I've got are these 4 functions, and each one of them relates to a specific type of sensor. And I've got essentially 4 different types of sensors. I've got the external sensor that I mentioned before, and there are some internal ones which are similar to that, which measure temperature and humidity. There's also the sensors which are attached to the radiator valves, and essentially I can set a particular temperature for that, 18 degrees, whatever it is, or I might want to turn it up higher to 21. But essentially what happens is that the valve is adjusted in order to reach that temperature. Probably the proviso here that I need to share with you is that what we don't want to find you doing is trying to set a higher temperature on the valve than is being generated from the central heating monitor and sensor that you're using with your system. In other words, if you're using, for instance, some sort of Hitachi device or some other proprietary device to control the overall temperature for your house, what you don't want to find is that that's set to a lower temperature than the temperature you're trying to reach with the valve, because all it will do is simply wait until the temperature gets high enough and then try to adjust it. You want to do it the other way around, in fact. What you want to do is possibly set a somewhat slightly higher temperature than the ones that you want to control in the individual rooms, and then use the valve to throttle down the temperature to what you want. That said, let's have a look at these different devices. So remember, I mentioned firstly that there is a sensor for the outside to give us the outside temperature. I've got sensors on the different radiators, and then I've got these independent temperature and humidity sensors that I've placed in different locations around the house. If I go into this one, for instance, I could go over here to invocations, wait for that to refresh. And if I look at this particular sensor here, you'll notice that these are the radiator sensors. And what you'll also see is that rather than simply applying the values to essentially the twin of the sensor, I'm now applying it to the actual room. So I'm using the value for the temperature there to be applied to the room. If I look at some of the other sensors which I have, so this is another type of sensor. I'll just go to invocations here. And if I click on this one, what you'll see is that this is the external temperature and humidity sensor. So that's important. And that is going to help me to understand the delta, the difference between the external and the internal temperature and humidity and so on. So that's quite important to do. The third of these functions is processing data. And you can see this if I click on this one here, that relates to a movement sensor that I can actually detect when somebody falls in a room. It uses radar technology, and in that sense, it is not actually using any video information. And it's really quite a powerful use of this technology. If you can imagine something like this being connected, for instance, to some sort of alert, and it has functions, for instance, inside of maybe a nursing home, for instance. And then the fourth of these, if we go to that one, as I mentioned before, these are the independent sensors for temperature and humidity that are in different rooms. These aren't the ones which are attached to the actual radiators. So that's important to notice. Having done that and processing that data, what we have is essentially something called the Digital Twins Explorer. Now, what we have here is what we describe as ontology. And you'll notice a couple of things. One is that I've now added the external temperature sensor. As you can see here, it's giving me the battery, the humidity, and the temperature. I can even get the actual timestamp for these. The last update was, as you can see there, that's for the battery, but you can see these ones for essentially the 27th at 8:29:33. And so you can see that this is giving you up-to-date information on these sensors. What you'll also notice, as I explained, is that although I have the values for temperature for the radiator valves, they don't have a humidity sensor. And there may be a case for me having a separate temperature and humidity sensor for each room rather than using these ones which are attached to the radiator, simply because the temperature near the radiator is always going to be, when it's turned on at least, higher than the average temperature in the room. So there might be a case for having a temperature sensor in the specific room. The important thing to notice here is that in each case, because of the way that I've now configured the processing of that data, that information is being replicated for the different rooms that we have here. So that's quite a significant change. The other significant change is I've got the ability to use graph-like queries to find data. Initially, this is just saying query all, and it brings up all of the different sensors and all the different rooms. But what if, for instance, I wanted to find all the rooms on ground floor which have a temperature of greater than 19 degrees? What you'll notice here is that I can join related. This is the relationship. So this is the graph relationship that is part of the ontology, where the floor ID is equal to floor 1. So it's going to be one of these rooms here, and the room temperature is greater than 19 degrees. I run that query, and it's found 3 rooms. We can check on each one of those, where the temperature, that's 19.2, that's 22.8, and this one's 21.6. So I can run graph-like queries using this system. I might want to, let's get back to the original query, which is essentially query all, and I can just run that query. It brings back everything again. But what if I wanted to find all of those rooms with temperature greater than 19, which were on the first floor in this case? So let's run that query. Notice in this case, the floor ID is floor 2, but room temperature is still greater than 19. Let's run that query to see what happens. And it shows me that all of these rooms, in fact, are above 19 degrees. But you can start to see the power of this in terms of a query language, which allows me to traverse the ontology, which is this structure of data, of relationships, and of specific entities. It allows me to traverse that. The one other query, of course, which I'm going to run, let's go back to the original query all and run that. It looks like this, is of course, I just want a single query that is going to find all rooms where the temperature is greater than 19 degrees. In this case, I've got where floor 1, 2, and the room temperature is greater than 19. Let's run that query. And of course, it brings all of these rooms together. This is a really powerful use of the graph-like capability that's within Digital Twins Explorer. If we then go to the visual of the digital twin, this is an environment called 3D Scene Studio. I'll just move this around. I'll go into my view for this. And what you can now see is that I've got the ability to turn off and on different types of sensors. So for instance, I could isolate just temperature, and I click on this. We notice that we've got a gauge and we've got essentially an indicator as to whether it sits within the boundaries of certain temperatures. There's some automation I can put into this. For instance, there's something known as a logic app, which allows me to automatically send an alert, maybe via WhatsApp. If the temperature was getting too high, it might send an alert, for instance, to a service engineer to go in and check on that particular space and so on. But these are all downstream things that can be done. You'll notice that in the case of the toilet area, let me just turn on just humidity, and you'll notice that for the areas that we do have, this is a good example, humidity is actually quite high for that particular space, as you can see, 73.5%. So there may be a case for me to think about how I can address that. And of course, there are some other, the fall detector is also one of those which I've set up in the room that I'm in right now. Right now, it's giving me the detection status for that. I can just select it here, and you'll notice that the detection status 0, which simply means that there's been no activity in terms of falls or anything like that. So this is a comprehensive environment where I can capture and visualize all of the data that's being collected from the different sensors. And it's eminently scalable. LoRaWAN allows me to do that. I probably, for a larger, let's say, office building, might invest in a more powerful set of gateways. There are some rules of thumb in terms of the number of floors that you should essentially be setting up the gateways for. Remember, the gateways are there to collect all the data from the sensors to channel that into Azure Digital Twins. So we might need to think about more of these gateways in order to accommodate a larger space. Having done that, I wanted to show you some of the improvements that I've made to the Digital Twin dashboard. And I'm just going to go through each one of these graphs in turn. Maybe the first one here, this is essentially showing my monthly gas consumption for last year and essentially previous years. What you'll see is, and remember this was estimated, but what you'll see is that last year, the estimated consumption in that month was actually 18 kilowatt hours. And on paper, it looks as though I'm not doing too well because, as you can see in the bottom right corner, I am now consuming 24.93 kilowatt hours for the month of September compared to 18. But the whole purpose of this, I've planned, I've implemented, I'm monitoring, and now I've got the ability to optimize. What you'll also notice is that just the overall consumption is there in a bar graph. And then this is the daily gas consumption. You can see that I've had some spikes on very cold days when we've just decided to turn on the heating. And we need to think now about maybe what can we do around improving our energy efficiency so that we essentially consume less gas, obviously. And to that end, one of the useful things is this graph here. There was a lot of work that went into producing this particular graph in the dashboard, because what I wanted to do was to produce a graph that showed gas consumption. I'll just go back to the report, actually. This one essentially goes the daily gas consumption, but the one that I actually wanted to talk about is one further down, which is this one here. And this one further down essentially is showing me a graph of gas consumption against change in temperature. I can sort of zoom in there for you, and maybe if I scroll this across, and then I will do a focus on this and zoom back out again. So essentially what this is telling me is that for a given difference between my internal and external temperature, which obviously can vary, as you can see, it's given me a trend line that gives me a clear view of something that's quite obvious, which is my gas consumption increases with the difference in temperature. What's really important about this is this gives me the ability to predict gas consumption based on that difference in temperature. So if I am seeking to achieve a particular set point, internal temperature, I don't know, let's say it's 21 degrees, and I have a forecast of the temperature conditions for that particular month. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, but what this is going to give me is the ability to predict gas consumption based on that difference in temperature. It's that straightforward. And that's really important. Now, the challenge that I had with this was that the data from the sensors is not on the same frequency as the data from my energy provider, which happens to be Octopus. The energy provider is issuing me data at 30-minute intervals, whereas the sensor data is being sent at, in some cases, 5-minute intervals, 10-minute intervals. So, and I'm not going to get into the weeds of this, but I then had to find a way to interpolate the values for temperature in such a way that they were following the same 30-minute intervals. So in a sense, what I'm doing there is some people refer to this as data wrangling, but I created some fairly complex formulas, and I have to say that the use of AI to be able to validate those formulas was invaluable. I would not have been able to get this work done without relying upon AI. Probably the other thing I want to point you to is these two graphs showing the room temperature and by date and sensor name, and you see that you've got the same here for humidity. The reason why it's important, of course, is that you can see that the sensor that relates to external temperature is this one called EM300 EXT, external. You can see the trend over the month has been, on average, towards lower and lower temperatures, which obviously explains why I've had to turn the heating on and obviously the energy that's been expended. The task I have ahead of me is to start to understand the interventions that I can use to reduce what that score is in terms of kilowatt hours consumed. September, we come into the end of that tomorrow, and Yes, it's 24.93 as opposed to 18 estimated last year. But if you look at, for instance, the next month, October is 24, as you can see there, and November, I'll just scroll up to it so that you can see it properly. November there is 79, 76, and 80. So there are opportunities as we move into the colder months to find ways to reduce my energy consumption. Now, what does this amount to? This system amount to? This amounts to what we describe as actionable intelligence. And there is a part of me that looks at this type of system and says, we need to get beyond just talking about it. We need to get beyond simply saying to people, this is a great idea, and in the future we'll do this with digital twins and that with digital twins, and we will have human digital twins and all kinds. It doesn't make sense. I mean, great. If you want to be a public speaker at events and feel that this amounts to thought leadership, fine. But my encouragement to everyone is, if digital twins is a tool in your job description on your job title, then start taking action. I have posted videos which will help you to get head around how digital twins work, and hopefully you'll be able to make the sort of progress with the ability to leverage AI to help you to be able to implement your own digital twins. And remember, if you need help in order to do that, feel free to reach out. I think we're part of a community and we need to begin operating as a community in that sense. So Dave Shepherd signing off, but as I said, this is the latest update in my digital twin journey. Thank you for listening. Bye.